What we're looking at here are US troops taking part in live fire drills at Grafenwohr training area, the largest base of its kind in Europe. Since the end of World War II, American forces have been in charge of this base and formed the bedrock of European security, sworn to come to the defense of its allies if they were ever attacked. But with Donald Trump back in the White House and questioning the value of those alliances, doubts are being raised about whether those decades-old promises are still valid. And with Vladimir Putin on the warpath, it begs the question, could Europe actually defend itself without America? We're going to examine the tapes, give you the big picture, and speak to an expert to find out. Here's Europe, an economic, population, and military powerhouse which, if it were united, would rival the world's biggest superpowers for dominance. But united it is not. In reality, this huge pool of resources is split across dozens of countries, many of them smaller than individual American cities. That division makes it vulnerable, particularly to attacks from the very large, often hostile neighbour just to its east. In order to deter Russia, Europe relies heavily on the US and has done so ever since the end of the Second World War. During the height of the Cold War in the 1950s, America had more than 400,000 troops in Europe to stop the Soviets from invading. You can see how that fell to 300,000 during a period of thawing relations in the 1970s, then plunged to just 100,000 after the USSR collapsed. George W. Bush reduced the number even further in the mid-2000s as the US focus shifted to the Middle East, but since then it's risen back to around 100,000 thanks to the withdrawal from Afghanistan and Iraq and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. America's oldest and largest military bases in Europe are located here, running from southern England through western Germany and into northern Italy. That's roughly where the old front line used to be between west and east. But now the USSR is gone. All of these countries have joined NATO, the military alliance that binds America to Europe, and US forces have been invited onto all of these bases. The majority of America's troops are still stationed on the old front line, but thousands are now further to the east, including significant numbers in Poland. That eastwards trend has accelerated since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, which Putin justified by saying the Soviets mistakenly gave the land away. That has made all these other ex-Soviet countries worry that they're next. And some experts warn Putin could be in a position to launch just such an invasion within 5 years. As things stand, if such a war were to kick off, the defense of Europe would fall in large part upon America. Here's what NATO's plans look like. As we've already seen, the US has forces spread out all along this eastern frontier. There's not a lot of them, but they're there. These are mixed in with NATO troops from dozens of allied nations, including the British, French, Germans, and Canadians. This is what's known as NATO's tripwire force. These troops will be the first to meet Russia in battle, but almost certainly there's not going to be enough of them to win that fight. What they're there to do is detect the invasion, then hold up Russia's attack for long enough so that all these troops behind the front line can join the fight. This is NATO's Tier 1 force, 100,000 men who can be ready to fight within just 10 days of an attack. Most, if not all, of those troops would have to be American, because European militaries are at low levels of readiness, and they could not get ready for combat at such short notice. Tier 2 forces would then follow, an additional 200,000 men which can be ready to fight within a month. This is where the Europeans would play more of a role. But according to Richard Hooker from Harvard's Belford Center, even the likes of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany would struggle to put more than one division each into the field. Assuming roughly 15,000 men per division, that's only around 60,000 men. Analysts from Bruegel, a Brussels-based think tank, are slightly more generous and assume Europe could field around 100,000 men. Whichever is more accurate, it's safe to say that at least half of the Tier 2 forces would be made up of Americans brought across the Atlantic from the homeland. And if necessary, they would be followed by Tier 3 forces, 500,000 men who could be on the front lines within 6 months. Again, the bulk of these are likely to be American, because it's unclear whether the Europeans could muster any more than the divisions they've already sent and sustain them in the field. what does it mean to sustain troops in the field? Well, armies aren't just a matter of raw manpower. Troop numbers tell you something, but not everything. Sustaining an army requires another army behind it, running logistics, carrying out surveillance, manning the headquarters, and doing everything that needs to be done so that when those frontline troops meet the enemy, they can fight as effectively as possible. And whilst the Europeans have enough of that stuff to sustain their own modestly sized armies, they do not have anywhere near enough to support an army that numbers in the hundreds of thousands. Again, they would have to rely on the Americans to provide all of that. If we go back to the tapes, then we can get a better idea of how all that works in practice. These are US troops training for combat missions in Grafenwohr, in Germany, where most US troops in Europe are based. It's a live fire range that is among the largest in Europe and was used by Adolf Hitler until the end of the Second World War. When that war was over and the US assumed responsibility for European security, they took over the base and have been here ever since. What they're training to do is fire HIMARS, a rocket artillery system that has proved particularly effective against the Russian army in Ukraine. Were NATO to come under attack from Russia, it would be these men who would become part of the Tier 1 force sent to face them. But what would happen if America suddenly decided to drop its commitment to defending Europe? Could Europe actually defend itself without the Americans? The first issue the Europeans would run into is raw manpower. Decades of cuts have left many European militaries a skeleton of their former selves. Take the British Army as an example. Aside from the two world wars where numbers soared, Britain has generally had somewhere between 300 and 400,000 soldiers in the army every year, going way back to the 1900s. But today, that number has fallen to just 74,000. For context, if you were to put the British Army inside Wembley, the country's largest football stadium, you'd have 16,000 spare seats left over. As we've already seen, NATO defense plans call for an army of at least 300,000 men and potentially another 500,000 on top of that if the war cannot be won quickly. If we assume the Europeans can field around 100,000 men collectively, that leaves a shortfall of 200,000 just to fight the opening stages of a Russian invasion. The next issue would be force readiness. Again, as we've already seen, the readiness of most European militaries is low. If Harvard's experts are to be believed, and we have no reason to doubt them, then it would take something like 90 days to get those 100,000 European troops into combat. That's 80 days too long, according to NATO's plans. So in addition to finding an extra 200,000 men, Europe would have to substantially raise the readiness of that force. That's much harder than it sounds. Raising and maintaining force readiness is expensive and time-consuming. It means having all your vehicles serviced and ready to go, troops at full fitness with supplies of fuel, food and ammo to hand, command structures prepared, logistics figured out, everything in place so that if war suddenly kicks off, the army can roll out with minimal fuss. All of that requires drills, and lots of them, to continuously test force readiness and fix any problems before they occur for real. Which brings us to the next issue, which would be all of the force enablers we mentioned that allow the army to fight effectively. Surveillance, logistics, headquarters, air power, and ammo, to name just a few. This is Europe's real Achilles heel. Right at the start of the video, we showed just how powerful a united Europe would be, and just how thin those resources are actually spread. Force enablers are the glue that binds an army together, and it is that unity where Europe is really lacking. Take commanders, for example. At the moment, NATO forces in Europe are overseen by a figure known as SACEUR, or Supreme Allied Commander Europe. By tradition, this is always an American general, and there's a good reason for that. Only America regularly turns out commanders capable of leading an army that size. As Olivier Schmidt, a professor at the Center for War Studies in Denmark, pointed out to The Economist a while back, aside from America, only the French, the Brits, and maybe the Germans on a good day have commanders who know how to do the job. Intelligence and surveillance is another good example. Poland, one of the countries that fears attack by Russia the most, is currently in the process of building a huge army. As part of that build-up, the Poles have bought hundreds of HIMARS, the rocket artillery system we saw those US troops training to use. So far, so good. The Poles have the numbers and the readiness. But here's the catch. To be effective, HIMARS need to fire at long range, much further than their crews can see. So they need surveillance, either via satellite or a spy plane, to pick their targets. And the Poles don't have that capability. They rely on the Americans to provide it. One final example before we move on is ammunition. This has been a constant problem for Ukraine, whose stockpiles are nowhere near large enough to fight a long war with Russia. Kiev has made up for that by begging ammo off the Europeans, whose own stockpiles are now very low and whose factories cannot keep up with the demand. Analysts at Bruegel, that Brussels think tank we mentioned earlier, estimate 1 million artillery shells will be required for just 90 days of full-intensity warfare with Russia. But at current production rates, it would take European arms makers a full year to turn out that much ammo. There are plenty more examples, but you get the picture. Manpower and readiness may be the most obvious problems, but really they're just the tip of the iceberg. Solving those problems would be a long and expensive task, which brings us to the final challenge that Europe faces: political willpower and the money that comes with it. This is where Europe has been severely deficient in the past. Shielded by the might of the Americans, European leaders treated security as a second or third order priority. Only now, as Trump has threatened to withdraw support, has the continent woken up and started to get its head around the problem. There's been lots of talking and promises of money, potentially some 800 billion euros, but that has yet to translate into concrete action. In fairness to European leaders, they are stepping up to the plate as Donald Trump walks the US back. Here's the leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Poland on a recent trip to Kiev to lend their support to President Zelensky. At this meeting, they threatened to double down on financial and military aid to Ukraine if Russia does not agree to Ukraine's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. Prior to this, it was America leading the way on peace talks. But after Russia stalled, President Trump pulled back, leaving the Europeans to take the lead. Elsewhere, Britain and France have been leading efforts to put together a coalition to guarantee Ukraine's security after the war is over. This could well involve putting troops on the ground in Ukraine, a role that would have traditionally been taken by the US, or guarding the skies with attack jets. Again, another US speciality which it has used to great effect in the skies over Israel. This sudden shouldering of responsibility has prompted a rush to buy new weapons that is firing up arms factories across Europe. Whether that's production of relatively old-fashioned artillery shells or cutting-edge FPV drones, the continent is now in the process of rearming. All of which is to say that Europe is starting to take its own defense seriously, even if it isn't ready to fight and win a war on its own just yet. Critics will argue that this is all too little too late. After all, it's not like Russia invaded Ukraine yesterday. The war has been dragging on for over 3 years, and only now has the wake-up call come. In fact, warning shots were fired all the way back in 2014, when Putin first attacked Ukraine and seized Crimea, and perhaps even earlier, in Georgia in 2008. However, late is better than never, and the message does finally seem to be getting through. We spoke to a commander from the US Army in Europe to get a better idea of America's role.
I'm Colonel Michael Wiseman. I'm a U.S. Army colonel, and I work at United States Army Europe and Africa here in Wiesbaden, Germany. So U.S. forces here in Europe, and we have U.S. forces stationed in many areas around the world, but we're here as kind of a bulwark of global deterrence. To deter adversaries alongside of our allies and partners. We've learned over successive conflicts that we're generally never going to fight alone, and so having access and placement alongside of our allies and partners, the ability globally to project power outside of the United States. We have bases here in our allied countries in Europe that allow us to do just that. So roughly we have about 40,000 soldiers, currently Army soldiers here in Europe as part of the total U.S. military. Primarily those soldiers, the bulk of which are in Germany at permanently assigned bases. We do have quite a bit of deployed and rotational forces. We've had several of them since 2014, and we increased again with the increased level of threat after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine.
America forms the bedrock of European security. How are Europe's defense plans shaped around the US?
So as one of the 30 nations in NATO, we certainly have a role in NATO's integrated defense plans, and there's things that we, the United States, are uniquely qualified for at the moment, simply due to the size of our military, the capabilities of our military. So when we talk about things like command and control of large echelons, that's something, because we have such a large military It'll take our allies and partners probably some time to build back up to the same capabilities that were resident, for example, during the Cold War. But when we talk about exercising and what it would take to actually conduct NATO's defense plans. So we do exercises here at U.S. Army Europe and Africa, along with our NATO allies through NATO's LANDCOM, where we use simulations, but we essentially put 7 core headquarters out in the field, which is, in simulation. In practice in the field, that would be hundreds of thousands of troops. So we're able to both simulate and build an exercise at that scale. But we're also, because of the fact that we have multiple U.S. corps, multiple field armies within the U.S. military, we're able to execute the command and control alongside of our NATO allies and partners. There's other things too. Large-scale logistics is something that we are probably recognized as a worldwide leader in, and things that we can do uniquely suited. And then there's other things, you've seen as NATO brigades become better equipped, as NATO nations are fielding more forces. You've got things like Estonia recently purchased HIMARS weapon systems. And so as allies are translating that investment in defense into real capabilities, I think you'll see that there's less U.S. mass needed as our allies enlist more capabilities.
How does the US work alongside its European allies?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of working in this theater here in Europe alongside of our NATO allies is the recent upgrades to the NATO's integrated defense plans. So for the first time in a generation, each of the countries, the US being one of them, has signed up to man and actually execute these defense plans that assign actual tactical tasks and command relationships, where every European nation in NATO and US and Canada know where its forces are going to go. And it allows us, with our relatively small presence here in Europe, to train alongside of our allies and partners to execute those plans. So for example, right now we've got the Defender exercise. That is something that is a rehearsal for us with our allies and partners of large scale combat operations. So we just had paratroopers jumping into Bardufoss, Norway from the American 82nd Airborne Division. They jumped in alongside the 2nd Para Battalion out of the UK. They jumped in with Hungarian airborne forces, and we were able, through live data and command systems online, to be able to essentially track that movement all the way from the US. And that simulates, we would bring forces into Europe alongside of our European allies that are already in the fight, and we would reinforce them. We can reinforce them through airborne operations to get them there quickly. We also have ships coming with more mechanized equipment that have taken about a month or so to get across the ocean, as the US would look at where we could apportion forces to help the fight. And then our 2nd Cavalry Regiment, that's based down in Grafenwehr and Vilseck, they actually were getting in their strikers and heading out to Southeast Europe at the same time. And that just kind of gives the perspective of large-scale combat operations. We have hospital exercises happening in the Baltics. We've got more airborne operations happening in Lithuania and Latvia, as well as Finland. The UK's forward land forces, they're doing an exercise with the Estonian national exercise right now. And all of those are tied into how we would actually defend NATO's territory by the plans that NATO has issued and the countries have agreed to. And so we're actually able to train as we would fight, which gives us the ability to rehearse and go through, but also to improve and constantly look at those plans.
Next, I wanted to know what more Europe can do to step up to the plate.
In the land force domain, I think you've got a once-in-a-generation opportunity to update your land forces. And so that's something that we're actively interested in with our relationship with NATO's land command, is that countries are buying the right systems that are interoperable, that we're buying things that we can be used, frankly, globally. Between the US and Europe combined, that's a ton of economic power. Together, we should be able to outproduce, especially when you add in our allies in the Pacific. We should be able to easily outproduce any of our adversaries. But how do you make sure that we're buying the same things that are interoperable, we're training in the same ways that are complementary? And so I think the opportunity for Europe right now is the same that the US is seizing, which is look at the changing character of war, array and transform your forces accordingly, realize that the decision cycles and the purchasing cycles are moving much faster. So one of the examples is we're not looking to buy 100,000 drones that are going to be out of date in a year and outfit the entire US Army. we're using a program that we call Transformation and Contact, where we go unit by unit and look over time as to what is the best set of equipment right now that unit can use, figure out what works and move to the next, but not lock ourselves into programs of record that are going to put us into a one weapon system for 30 years when the technology changes so fast.
The Ukraine war has completely reshaped European defense. What lessons are the US and the Europeans learning from that war?
First off, I'd say Ukraine war has been an absolute game changer in terms of the scale and what conflict looks like. And that has been absolutely transformative for not just the US military, but also our allies and partners here in Europe, as they, are putting more and more money into defense and modernization. A lot of the lessons that we're learning about what conflict does look like and the future of conflict is coming directly from Ukraine. And in our partnership, in terms of the support we've provided to the Ukrainians, we have learned an amazing amount about the changing character of war. It's directly informed the types of units that we're building in the U.S. Army. It's informing how we're training. It's informing how we're training with our allies and partners. Everything from drones, which have become ubiquitous, and unmanned systems on the battlefield, but also the need to make decisions faster, to integrate AI and live data so that we can outthink and accelerate our decision process. So first of all, just the integration of autonomous warfare into the battle space. I mean, the U.S. military, as other military, has been using drones for decades. There's been stories about Predator drones and how that has changed warfare just in the last 20 plus years. But what you're seeing now is that the cycle of change in Ukraine is happening faster and faster. And so one, it's completely changed our procurement mindset of how fast we need to both identify, buy, and invest in technology, and the scale at which we need to be able to do it. But also it's shown on the battlefield there, you can be seen anywhere, and whether that's by a small drone or whether by your signature. And so it has really challenged us to look at how we fight across the spectrum, both from an electronic warfare perspective, but also how do you protect your assets? How do you deliver effects? It is a wholesale change to some of the principles, remain the same with mass and momentum and things like that. But it is certainly insightful to learn.
Of course, Russia isn't the only threat the West faces.
Yeah, absolutely. You've seen essentially the coalescence of global threats. In Russia, a lot of Chinese equipment is being used. You've got North Korean troops that are fighting there now on the Russian side, as well as the use of North Korean and Iranian equipment. And so as these threats are connected, they go from theater to theater. And one of the benefits that we have of being here in Europe alongside some of our most capable allies and partners is they also have equities in the Indo-Pacific and vice versa. We work closely with our counterparts in the Indo-Pacific, as well as our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And so really that is why we say it is integrated global deterrence, because there is, while Russia is the acute threat in Europe, it is certainly not the only threat that is here.
At least as far as the Colonel is concerned, the US Army in Europe is here to stay.
It's an exciting time to be in the US Army here. It's an exciting time to be a part of NATO. Like I said, we are learning rapidly. Our Chief of Staff of the Army likes to say that it's not a lesson learned until you've actually changed the way you're doing something. It's only a lesson observed. And so we have an opportunity alongside our allies and partners to truly learn lessons from what is happening in Ukraine and beyond, and other conflicts around the world, and make sure that we have time to prepare, train our forces, and modernize so that we can actually provide true global deterrence here.
That's where this tape stops, but we'll be back soon to play you through another piece of Geopolitics on Tape.